Hi and welcome back to Garden Ninja. Now today's video is going to show you how I created my own garden, the exploding atom garden in all of its glory. Now this garden has been a labour of love for me since I moved here because, would you believe it, this here was just an empty field. So I'm going to take you through the process of how I've designed this, why I've designed it, the plants in there, and give you a before and after to show you what I've done in my own garden. Because you often see me on TV designing for other people, but what does Garden Ninja design for himself? So grab yourself a brew and let's go on a journey around the exploding atom garden. If you've not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, hit the red button to subscribe today. Also click the bell for notifications. We'll have access to hundreds of garden design hints, tips and hacks from me, the Garden Ninja. And best of all, it's free. The exploding atom garden started 6 years ago when I moved house and ended up with my dream garden, an 1.5 acres of uninterrupted paddock, absolutely nothing there but a few trees and loads of grass. And so I set about thinking, how can I create my dream garden that's both sympathetic and also considerate to the environment, that mixes all of my favourite plants and creates an area of wonder in the garden that I can enjoy, learn and propagate plants. So I set about with the idea of the exploding atom garden. And because my granddad worked for the Nuclear Energy Board in the design department, that's where I took my inspiration, because he was a dab hand at creating technical drawings and I wanted to bring that memory of him to my garden. The whole basis of the exploding atom garden is that at the centre we've got the red hot core of the atom, and then all the beds are like shards that explode out, moving through the colour wheel from dark purples on the way out to pink before we finish with light white, airy, almost weedy like planting. So at the centre we've got these gabions and red hot plants, but it's actually quite a formal design for me, but I wanted to make it conceptual and also give a journey around the garden. After I'd finished the design, it was time to mark it all out using a central pin and then bits of string to mark out the curves of this concentric garden. As I said, it's a really formal space, but the planting is going to really soften it up. But this marking out process took about a week, because as you can imagine, we've got just over 1/2 acre for this part of the garden, and it had to be precise. The trundle wheel came out, lots of tape measures, before finally lifting the turf from the beds. Now the turf cutting was a mammoth undertaking. It took about 3 weeks, it happened throughout early autumn into winter, and it was a real grind, I'll be honest. But these beds were going to form the basis of the exploding atom garden. All the turf was recycled onto my compost heap, and it really started to take shape. As you can see, the outline is coming to life now. An awful lot of space, and quite overwhelming actually. Then it was time for tree planting. A big part of the design was a mix of native trees that were going to act as punctuation in the garden. These trees are going to give structure, and you know how much I love vertical height from my work on garden rescue, so I wanted to use some really big trees to help ground the garden, because before the trees it still just looks like a field with a bunch of bare earth cut out from it. We then had some really bad weather. You don't really want to be planting trees in the winter when it's frosty, but I had to wait. I finally got the trees in when the ground softened, and you can just about start to see the garden coming to life. And this is the exciting bit. The design starts to map out onto the ground, and then it's almost slowly emerging as if it's been pulled up from the earth itself. I also did a lot of winter pruning of the existing trees to make sure that they fit into the garden. So this year one was a really busy year. We then had a crazy cold winter, loads of snow, before spring finally emerged and it was time to edge the borders. Now, we had something bonkers, like 250 metres of edging to go in. So I chose this German-engineered recycled plastic edging just to keep those crisp lines. If I hadn't have edged the borders, as you well know, garden ninjas, the grass would creep in and they'd start to lose the definition. The edging took me about 3 weeks, on and off. It was a real labour of love, but I knew I had to get it right to keep that crisp edge. And it's well worthwhile if you're designing a garden to make sure that you future-proof it by doing things like edging and making sure that your maintenance is kept to a minimum if you're time poor. A large part of the design was to use gabions and fill them with recycled materials that were left over from the house build some 30 years ago. And this was a real time burn. As part of the design, I thought they'd look really arresting and also act as huge bug hotels, which they do. However, building so many of them is really time consuming, and because I wanted to use a pattern inside the gabions, it took even longer. Now, although it took a long time to get them level and to stack all the different materials in this pattern, I'm really proud of them because I got to reuse all of the materials that otherwise would just sit there or end up in landfill, and it really adds that heavy definition to the garden. And sometimes in design we call this mass and void. So the gabions are the mass, they are heavy, and then the gaps in between the borders, such as the grass and the paths, are the void. They're the empty space that give designs that balance. You can see me here slowly but surely filling them. I mean, this one gabion I think took me about 2 days, and given the fact there's 6 gabions in the garden, you can see how much time it took. But I'm really pleased with them, and sometimes it's details like this that bring a garden to life. It's worthwhile focusing on doing a few things really well, rather than either trying to do everything at a very rushed pace or put detail into everything. That mass and void theory applies to detail. You want to be really focused with it and then leave the rest quite soft to make a design work. You can see the gabions coming to life now. The ones at the back are empty, and obviously the ones closer are full, and then here you can see them, and they really do add that punctuation to the garden. Finally, time to plant up the garden. You might think that I just went out and sourced a load of plants using all of my contacts, but I didn't. I actually grew 80% of these plants from seed or cuttings and propagation techniques. And the reason for that was I wanted to use some really unusual plants, native perennial species, and things that have kind of fallen out of favour here in the UK, to bring diversity to the garden for insects and wildlife, but also help keep those plant species alive. This took an awful lot of time, as you would expect. I love growing things from seed. I had all sorts of weird and wonderful plants like Indula helenium. I even sowed loads of borage. We've got salvias, grasses, Achillea melliforum, all sorts of really interesting species that I would find hard to source. And the beauty of growing plants from seed yourself is that you really get to know those plants. And this was almost a bit of a trial ground to work out what would work and what wouldn't, which would then help influence my other designs across the UK. I tried to grow as many plants that were full of pollen and nectar for wildlife, in particular honeybees and nighttime moths as well. I wanted to make sure that the garden didn't just look beautiful, but also had a real wildlife purpose. And this is really important to me. I planted up the garden over a course of about 2 years, growing everything from seed where I could, while taking cuttings and propagations elsewhere. I learnt so much about the different plants that I use in the garden because I'd grown them myself. And that's not to say that you need to do the same thing, but if you've got the time and the effort, growing plants from seed or propagations will make you better acquainted with the conditions that those plants really like, and therefore make you a far better gardener in the process. Here's Barry coming to sniff and inspect some of the plants. I think this was year 2 now, so everything's been put into position, planted, and we're just waiting for things to establish. You can see things are kind of dotted around in matrix fashion, and they look really small and tiny and unassuming. But when you're planning a garden like this, you need to make sure that you consider the ultimate height, spread, and growth pattern of the plants. Weeding was a huge battle in this garden because there's so much open space and bare earth. I used an oscillating hoe to get between the plants and weed as much as I could. And And here you can see in year 2 things are starting to establish and fill out, meaning less weeding and also less watering, but it still does look a little bit bare. So I keep plugging away, filling the gaps with new plants that have grown to make sure that the whole garden is fit to burst in year 3. Now take a look. Year 3 and the garden is packed full of beautiful plants, different heights and specimens, and it feels like a real garden finally after these 3 years. And I'm super pleased with it. Each of the rings has its own definition and distinct style, but the whole garden connects as a whole. Now, time to finally invest in some heavy machinery with a ride-on mower, because before this I was actually mowing that whole area with a push mower. A bit ridiculous. So the cherry bomb arrives and I'm ready to start mowing the garden and then bringing it to life with clean stripes within the lawn. And using the ride-on is a really nice way to seed the garden throughout the seasons, as once a week I go around and mow it all, make sure it looks really neat. And time for the big reveal. Let's have a look at it in year 4. But first, here's the aerial view, courtesy of Google Maps, and you can really see all of those shapes of the exploding atom garden. And this is the bit I love the most, looking at the aerial view, because you can see how all those measurements worked out. And this is another of my favourite views with my new drone, which is seeing the garden way above and just looking at the proportion of it against the house and the surrounding landscape. This clip's quite funny. First day of getting the drone, I thought I'll do a fly around to show the garden, but actually at the end of this clip I crashed the drone. But it just shows you that pattern again in the layout of the garden, and I'm so pleased with it because the whole space now is usable. There are paths to walk around, there's a story to it, a journey, mass void and loads of pollen-rich plants for bees and wildlife. So this really is a wildlife garden at its heart, but using that formal shape to bring it together and connect it to the house. So I'm going to leave you now with a few beautiful shots of the garden so you can have a good nosy round. So there we have it, a time lapse of how I created this garden and why I'm absolutely in love with it and all the native plants and features that it brings to this one blank space. If you've liked this video, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel where there are hundreds of garden design, hints, tips and hacks to help you make your gardens awesome. If you want to learn more about garden design, why not sign up for one of my online garden design courses where you can learn how to do things like this at your own pace in your own time. Unleash your inner creativity by becoming a garden designer a bit like me. Have you got gardening questions that you need answers for? Well, why not head over to the Garden Ninja forum on my blog where you can ask me anything about gardens, plants and garden design. There's a whole army of other garden ninjas there that can help provide answers to your questions. It's a really great way to meet the other ninjas, so head over there now. So, until next time, garden ninjas, bye for now.